Hello and welcome to our YouTube channel. I'm Alex, and today we have a special guest with us. She is Sophia, and together, we are going to help you improve your English in a fun and interactive way. Welcome, Sophia.
Thank you, Alex. I'm really excited to be here. Learning English doesn't have to be boring, and today, we'll make it easy and enjoyable for everyone.
All right, so have you ever heard someone say it's raining cats and dogs and thought, what do they mean?
Yeah, definitely doesn't mean look out for falling animals.
Exactly, like what are they talking about? Well, today we're going to be doing a deep dive into idioms, these kind of quirky expressions that, well, they don't always mean what the words literally say.
Right, like a secret code.
Yeah, a secret code, and we'll uncover not just what they mean, but also why they exist and how you could start using them yourself to sound more like a native speaker.
That's right.
Because honestly, who hasn't been there? I remember I was in Italy once, and you know how people always say, oh, ordering a piece of cake that's easy in any language. Well, I tried that, and the baker looked at me like I was crazy.
Yeah, that's a great example, though. It really shows how idioms are so deeply tied to a specific culture.
Right. It's like learning a whole new language within a language.
It really is, and that's why mastering them is so important. It's not just about fluency, it's about understanding all those subtle cultural layers that really add a lot of depth to the way you communicate.
Okay, so let's break this down. Like, what exactly is an idiom? An idiom is basically a phrase where the meaning isn't literal, right?
Exactly.
Like break a leg.
Doesn't mean go around wishing people boom fractures.
Exactly. It's like wishing someone good luck.
Yeah, usually in a performance.
Ah, okay, in a performance. And speaking of performances, let's unpack some of the most common idiom themes. And I feel like weather is a good one to start with because, I mean, everyone talks about the weather.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is how many idioms we have just to describe rain.
Yeah, like raining cats and dogs.
Where do you go?
But where on earth did that one come from?
You know, it's actually a bit of a mystery, but one theory is that it goes back to a time when heavy rains would actually wash stray animals through the streets.
Oh.
So imagine cats and dogs being swept along with all the floodwaters. It would definitely create a very vivid image.
That's a little too vivid for me,
Yeah.
but it does make you think about how idioms capture a snapshot of history.
Exactly. And here's another weather one. What about save for a rainy day?
Oh, I use that one all the time when I'm talking about budgeting and finances. It's like a reminder to be prepared, you know, for unexpected expenses.
Exactly. But it also makes you wonder, is that a universal human concern, or is that something specific to cultures that, you know, experience a lot of rainy days?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Okay, so besides weather, another theme that pops up all the time in idioms is time.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because who isn't battling the clock these days?
It's a universal struggle.
It is. So what are some idioms that have to do with time?
Well, there's once in a blue moon.
Oh, once in a blue moon. I actually remember trying to explain this to a friend who was learning English, and he thought it meant you had to wait for the moon to literally turn blue.
Oh, that's funny.
I know.
It's a common misunderstanding, but it just shows how important it is to not just learn the idiom, you know, the words, but the whole cultural context behind it.
Yes, totally. And then there's time flies when you're having fun, which always seems to be true, especially when I'm watching my favorite show.
Yeah, that's a classic. But it also makes you wonder, like, did people perceive time differently before we had clocks and, you know, schedules ruling our lives?
That's a great question.
Maybe time really did feel slower back then.
Maybe. Like I said, we've talked about weather, we've talked about time, but what about money?
Ah, money.
Because I think we all wish we had a money tree growing in our backyard.
Wouldn't that be nice?
Right.
Speaking of money, there's the idiom cost an arm and a leg.
Oh, yeah. That new phone cost me an arm and a leg.
Exactly. But it makes you wonder, what did people consider outrageously expensive back then? You know, when that idiom was first used.
Oh, maybe a castle or a ship.
Right.
Like, it's funny how the meaning stays relevant even though what we think of as expensive has totally changed.
It is. And then there's go Dutch.
Oh, yeah.
Which means splitting the bill equally. I always wonder if people in the Netherlands actually use that phrase.
Oh, that's a good question.
Or if it's just something we say.
Maybe we need to do a deep dive on Dutch idioms. All right, so we've covered weather, time, money. But let's not forget about, you know, those moments of triumph and defeat, those ups and downs of life, because we all experience those.
Absolutely.
What are some idioms that capture those feelings?
Well, there's the idiom, hit the ground running.
Oh, that one I always struggle to use naturally, I feel like.
Yeah.
It means like to start something energetically and enthusiastically, right?
Exactly. And it makes me think about those first few days of like a new job or a new project.
Oh, yeah.
There's all this pressure to prove yourself, make a good first impression.
It's like everyone expects you to be a superhero right from the start.
Exactly. And speaking of superheroes, there's the idiom, bite off more than you can chew.
Oh, I've been there so many times.
I think we all have.
It's that feeling of taking on too much, and then suddenly you're like, oh my gosh, I'm drowning.
Yeah, it's a good reminder to, be realistic about our limits and to ask for help when we need it.
Totally.
Yeah.
So we've explored a ton of idioms across different themes, and I have to say I'm already feeling a little more confident just talking about them. But now, the big question, how do I actually start using these things in real life without sounding like I'm, trying too hard?
That's a great question, and that's a common fear for language learners. Nobody wants to sound like they're reading from a textbook.
Exactly.
So what are your tips?
What are your tips for sounding natural and confident when you're using these idioms?
Well, first of all, don't try to cram in as many as possible.
Okay.
Choose a few that you know really resonate with you and that you can imagine yourself using.
Got it.
And practice using them in situations where they actually make sense.
So like if I'm having coffee with a friend and they're feeling stressed,
Yeah.
I could say, hey, don't worry, every cloud has a silver lining.
Exactly. You're offering encouragement, but you're also incorporating an idiom naturally.
I like it.
And remember, it's a process. Don't get discouraged if you make mistakes or if it feels awkward at first.
So baby steps, gradual progress.
Exactly. Think of it as adding spices to your language, one pinch at a time. The goal is to flavor your conversations, not to, overpower them.
Okay, I love the spice analogy. So we've tackled the how-to of using idioms. But what about the why? Why bother learning these sometimes confusing phrases?
That's a great question. It's not just about sounding fluent. It's about understanding those cultural nuances that really make a language come alive. Idioms often reflect a culture's history, their humor values, even their worldview.
So by learning idioms, we're actually gaining a deeper understanding of the people and culture behind the language.
Absolutely. It's like unlocking a secret door that reveals all these hidden cultural treasures.
I love that. It makes language learning feel more like an adventure.
It does. And who knows, maybe you'll even discover an idiom that perfectly captures an experience you've had but you couldn't quite put into words before.
Ooh, now that would be mind-blowing.
Those are the moments that make language learning so rewarding.
Okay, I'm totally on board with this idiom adventure. But let's face it, there are a ton of idioms out there. Where do we even begin?
That's a common challenge. I think the key is to not get overwhelmed.
Don't try to memorize every single one.
Exactly. Start with a few that you encounter frequently or that you find particularly interesting.
So maybe like pick one or two from each theme we discussed today and try to use them in conversations this week.
That's a great strategy. And pay attention to how native speakers use them in context.
So watch movies, listen to music, eavesdrop on conversations.
Exactly. The more you immerse yourself in the language, the more natural it will become to use those idioms in your own conversations.
Okay, I'm feeling inspired. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about idioms reflecting a culture's history. I find that so fascinating. Can you give us more examples of how historical events have actually shaped English idioms?
Absolutely. One that comes to mind is bury the hatchet.
Oh yeah, bury the hatchet. I've heard that one. It means to make peace end a conflict.
Exactly. And it supposedly comes from Native American traditions of literally burying their hatchets as a symbol of peace.
Wow, it's like a physical action transformed into a metaphor.
It is. And then there's spill the beans, which means to reveal a secret.
Oh, spill the beans.
Yeah.
Okay, but what's the historical connection there?
Well, one theory is that it goes all the way back to ancient Greece, where voting was sometimes done by putting beans in jars.
Oh, wow.
So if someone accidentally knocked over the jar, they would spill the beans and reveal the outcome of the vote.
That's so cool. It makes you wonder how many other idioms have these fascinating backstories.
There are so many. And it just goes to show, how language really is a reflection of our shared human history.
Okay, so we've uncovered some hidden historical gems, but now I'm curious about how idioms might differ across regions, because even within a single language like English, there's so many variations.
Oh, absolutely. It's like each region has its own unique dialect and set of expressions.
Right.
For instance, in the southern U.S., you might hear someone say, bless your heart,
Oh yeah, bless your heart.
which can have a variety of meanings depending on the context.
I've heard that. Sometimes it's genuine sympathy, and sometimes it's like, oh, bless your heart.
Exactly. It's all about understanding those subtle nuances of the region. And up north, you might hear someone say, wicked. to mean very or extremely.
Like wicked cool.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how these variations add so much color and character to the language.
It does. And it reminds us that language is constantly evolving and adapting to these local cultures.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our idiom adventure. But before we move on, I want to ask you one more question. Do you think idioms are becoming more or less common in modern English?
That's a really interesting question, and it's one that linguists are actually debating.
So is there like a right answer?
It's not that simple.
Okay.
Some argue that idioms are becoming less common as language becomes more globalized and standardized.
So we're all using more generic language to be able to communicate across cultures.
Exactly. But others argue that idioms are still thriving, especially in spoken language and informal settings.
Because there's such a powerful way to express yourself and connect with others.
Precisely. And I tend to agree with that perspective. I think idioms are a really essential part of what makes language colorful and engaging.
All right, well, that's a debate we'll have to continue another time. But for now, I'm feeling inspired to sprinkle some more idioms into my conversations.
That's the spirit. And remember, don't be afraid to experiment and have fun with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
After all, language is about more than just rules and grammar. It's about expressing ourselves and connecting with others in a meaningful way.
Well said. And I think idioms play a huge role in that.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our idiom exploration. We've defined what idioms are explored, some common themes, discussed how to use them confidently, and even touched upon their historical and regional variations. But now I think it's time for a little break. We'll be back soon with more fascinating insights into the wonderful world of idioms.
Stay tuned. You know, one thing that always fascinates me about idioms is how they can reveal so much about a culture's values and priorities.
Oh, that's